Well, like she said, my name is Hermanson. I'm from the Department of Political Science and International Relations. And the title of my presentation is Destination Countries for Human Trafficking, an Institutional Approach. So what kind of led me to this question was that most of you have probably noticed that human trafficking has been more and more coming to light in the news and in international discussion. As recently as August 2010, the UN Secretary General himself renewed kind of this call to action from many departments in the UN for a collaborative approach to try to end human trafficking because they estimate more than 2.4 million trafficking victims between 1995 and 2005. This number is actually probably much higher. I've seen U.S. State Department estimates as much as 700,000 to 2 million victims per year, not over this 20-year period. So we still don't quite know exactly the magnitude of the problem, but it's pretty much in agreement that it needs to be addressed. When I consulted the literature, kind of delved into studies on this, I saw that there were a lot of journalistic and descriptive accounts, but almost no theory as to why it occurs, I found zero empirical studies using data. So that led me to ask the question, under what conditions does a nation state become a destination country for human trafficking? If we're going to talk about human trafficking, obviously we need to know what are we talking about. The UN definition has been kind of the most widely used definition. It has three main parts. The action is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons through the means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion. And the purpose is obviously for exploitation. And some exploitation can be defined in different ways. It generally falls into two categories, such as sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And the definition of destination country is simply the nation state to which the legal transfer of persons occurs. So I'd like to just talk briefly of how I came to this hypothesis in theory. As I was going through the literature, I noticed a few main bodies of literature that touched on possible explanations for human trafficking. Feminist theory does a bit because women are the most, obviously the highest percentage of trafficking victims. So they kind of, feminist theorists, would discuss human trafficking because they would say it was because women are inherently more insecure, and kind of as society modernizes, women are expected to work and provide for the family, which would make them seek migration and thus kind of fall victim to these traffickers. I didn't really feel like that explanation had a lot of explanatory power. I moved on to modernization theory, which surfaced in the late 60s, which kind of talks about how people move, states modernize, and things move from kind of the backward, old to, the new, the modern. And so that's what explains migration, is people see this new modern as a better place for them, as more economically viable, so they make these comparisons in their head and then choose to migrate. And in the case of trafficking, they would choose to seek maybe the help of migration agencies that appear to be legitimate businesses but end up being traffickers. So that's kind of where the literature was. I wanted to move forward to institutional theory, and institutional theory surfaced more in the 70s and 80s. Studies mostly which institutions, like central banks and the way the legislature is set up and all of that, how that affects outcomes. And so I took that even further to say the strength of institutions is kind of what matters. Levitsky and Erler are two scholars that said that the rules on parchment in a constitution don't matter unless the institutions are actually strong, because we saw a lot of the democracies that surfaced in the 70s and 80s fail. We saw the rules they wrote on parchment on their constitutions didn't happen. So that led me to my variable of interest, which is an interaction term. It's a statistical concept which basically combines two variables, the strength of institutions and anti-trafficking policies. My rationale or my theory is that institutions are means to increase the enforcement and knowledge of the rules and the stability of the rules. So if you have strong institutions, people know what the rules are and they know that the rules will be in place for a while. But if there are no rules about human trafficking, then strong institutions will not solely have an effect on human trafficking. You have to have the anti-trafficking policy to really make this work. I have data from the International Office of Migration. It's a count of the number of victims. trafficked to each particular country. Unfortunately, the International Office of Immigration does not release disaggregated data. They don't release it by year and country or really by anything other than just this aggregated number of over this 10-year period. It's flawed in many ways. It's not a complete number by any means. It's a database of 14,000, whereas, like we talked about earlier, there's as many as 2 million per year. But they have a basis for statistical analysis and a place to start. Like I said, I didn't find any in the literature. So moving on, my variable of interest is a combination of these two variables, the strength of institutions, which I took from Polity 4. It's a pretty well-known data set. They have a polity variable, and so when I squared that variable, it ended up being that all of the weak autocracies and democracies were clustered near 0, and all of the strong democracies and autocracies were clustered closer to 100. And then there's anti-trafficking policy, which comes from a tier ranking given by the United States Department of State. So as that increases, it means that the country is doing a better job at complying with the minimum standards of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So how I created this interaction term is I multiplied these two variables. My control variables were executive constraints, also from the Polity 4 data set, and this was my way of kind of trying to get at democratic institutions specifically. I couldn't put in just the democracy variable because it correlated too highly with one of my other variables. I also put in gross domestic product, and this was my way of kind of testing that modernization theory that I discussed earlier is kind of a question of can this be described or explained only by saying people go from poor countries to rich countries. So that's why I added those in. My method is negative binomial regression. The data are not normally distributed in a nice curve like this. They're clustered in the smaller numbers, and they extend from 1 to 2,000. So this particular kind of data calls for this particular kind of regression. Now, these are my results. This is where this pointer will come in handy. They're not, I wouldn't spend any time trying to directly interpret them, just because of the type of regression. It's based in logistic regression, so they're not directly interpretable. We can see here that the strength of institutions had a negative effect, or a negative relationship with the number of victims, but looking for these little stars, these mean a level of statistical significance, and statistical significance basically says that we can say with some degree of confidence that there is a relationship, because in social science there's always this possibility that no relationship exists, and so this little star means we could say with 95% confidence that this relationship exists, and this little guy says we have 90% confidence. So moving on, anti-trafficking policy also had a negative relationship to the number of victims. So as the policy gets better, goes up, the number of victims comes down. So that was what I predicted. That was good. However, I had an issue here. Both of the constituent terms of this policy strength, which is the multiplication of both of these, both the constituent terms have a negative relationship, and I hypothesized this to be a negative relationship, but we see here that it's positive at the 90% confidence level. So I'm going to get back to why that might be. Executive constraints was also significant, and this had a positive relationship, which maybe suggests that people are trafficked to democracies more often. It's difficult to say whether that's exactly true, but executive constraints, like I said, it's a measure of it's a democratic institution essentially. So, why I think that this ended up being counterintuitive to what I predicted is a problem known as multicollinearity. And basically, whenever you include an interaction term, you'll encounter this problem, because by including this, and then the multiplication of this, we measure the same thing multiple times in the model. So this can affect things. The biggest effect it might have is actually changing the signs of variables. So the real relationship here is probably negative, and probably as a result of multicollinearity it showed up positive here. Now, I still feel justified in leaving this in the model because we always go back to theory, and if theory says we need it in the model, then that trumps multicollinearity, I guess, in statistics. But kind of my conclusion then, this is definitely a preliminary study. It's not a study in and of itself. This is a research agenda. So I don't know right now if the model is showing the true effect of the interaction or if it's simply a problem with multicollinearity. And what I need to do is basically find a new variable that measures policy strength so that I can take out the two constituent variables and the interaction term and get rid of the problem of multicollinearity. So then I can see the real relationship. If it's not the true effect, if I do find that variable and I put it in and it's either not significant or it's still a negative relationship, I need to also explore other hypotheses. Something that I have kind of become interested since have been trade flows, both illicit and licit. That might kind of explain, as we see, for example, the illegal drug trade. Just because the United States has better policies and might have the strongest drug enforcement agency, it also probably has some of the highest inflows of illegal drugs, and that's because these people are really great at getting around strong institutions. So maybe that's not even, maybe what I predicted here is not even the answer. So I have a lot more to do on this study. For now, it should serve as this first attempt to use the data available. And as a contribution to the discussion, there's a growing discussion in the literature about the need to improve data collection methods and improve data collection initiatives, just more money to poor countries to help them collect data, just because of this need for more quantitative empirical analysis of the problem. So, thank you. Any questions?